On her first day going into school, even though I'd pre-warned them that she was vegan, they told me that they weren't going to provide a lunch for her. My entire life, everything I believe, everything I've been taught by people who I respected, my parents, my teachers, religious leaders, all of these people had told me that one thing was correct, and I had to now navigate the fact that I deeply, genuinely believed that it wasn't. Somebody way back when they made this rule up, had decided that it wasn't fair to mix the meat of the mother with the milk of the intended calf at the same table. And I'm thinking, you're so close. I promote a humane curriculum that celebrates non-human animals, but doesn't use non-human animals. Educators have the power to foster that innate love, that compassion, that beautiful thing that I believe all children are born with, if they're teaching a humane curriculum.
Good afternoon, Laura. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
No, it's wonderful to have you here. And again, you're one of my rare guests I've actually met in person. We bumped into each other at VegFest in London a while ago, and we've managed to speak offline about some of the topics we're going to cover today. So it's great to have you on the Sentientism podcast as a proper guest. It's brilliant.
Thank you. I know. And hopefully a friendship can form.
I hope
if we've
so
managed
too.
to last this long.
Exactly. This could be our third conversation. So I think we're doing already.
It may very well be. I think I've spoken to you more often than some really good friends of mine who would just tend to leave it a year or so. So yes,
it's a good start.
I'm really pleased.
So you know this already, I guess, but this series of conversations are about what I think of as the deepest and most important philosophical questions, and unfortunately ones that most of humanity still get wrong for the moment. And they're the questions of, what's real? How do we understand reality in the universe we all share? And just as importantly, the questions of ethics, what matters and who matters and what should we do about that? And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to develop and popularize this very pluralistic, broad, but quite radical worldview that I'm calling sentientism. And in a sentence, it's evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So when we're thinking about the what's real question and how to understand stuff, it just says, look, let's try and use evidence and reason and hopefully with a dose of humility to try and understand reality by engaging honestly with it. And when it comes to the ethical questions, it's very pluralistic and broad. There's loads of different ways you can think about ethics, but it insists that every sentient being, every being that has the capacity to have experiences, to feel pain, to feel joy, anything at all, should be included in our compassion and our moral consideration. But in these conversations, I talk to a dazzling variety of people, some of whom agree and some of whom don't. So it'll be interesting to explore your own sort of philosophical journey and how that leads into our final big question about how do we try and make a better world and the amazing work you do. So before we get onto those big philosophical questions, how would you best introduce yourself for people who don't know you and your work already?
So I currently work in a position and I'm titled the Education Officer at the Vegan Society. So I head up the education department. My work is split into two. I do lots of other peripheral stuff, but the two main aims, I suppose, of my work are, one half of my time is spent supporting vegan learners in education, vegan families of those learners in education. Basically, a vegan who finds himself in mainstream education who has either been directly or indirectly discriminated against or just feels misunderstood. So a lot of my work has been leading up to being able to support those people. And then secondly, because I'm a former teacher, I was a primary school teacher 1,000 years ago, and that was my first love and my first passion. I figured if I'm going to put all this time and effort into supporting vegan learners in education to become more understood, then it's equally as important to support the educators, because if you just throw a vegan into a setting where one hasn't been before, it can be quite overwhelming or even underwhelming. Teachers might not care, they might not know. There's just a lot of misunderstanding and misinterpretation, and that's where the indirect discrimination can happen. And so I've also built and developed the world's first and only CPD training course in how educators can better their everyday practice to become vegan inclusive. So I basically want to help and do in my role. I'm very lucky because it's my passion, both veganism and education have come together so I can support learners in education and those delivering education. I'm also chair of the Vegan Society's Education Network, which is I would say, 25-person strong group of educators from all over the UK, from different areas of education, who all come together to support me in my role to create brilliant resources. So as you can imagine, that fills a lot of my time, and I'm very happy to be doing it.
That's great. Thank you. And it's a fascinating story that we'll come back to later. But so much of veganism, understandably, is focused on, helping non-human animals. And in a way, that's a lot of the point, although arguably it should be helping us human animals too. But it's fascinating that you're actually very directly helping vegans themselves resist discrimination and make sure they get the right support, that we're extending our compassion to, the people who themselves are trying to help. We maybe tend to neglect ourselves sometimes in this.
Well, it all stemmed from personal experience, because I left having been a teacher because I became vegan, and I felt that the curriculum clashed with my ethics too much.
Yeah.
And I did things in the meantime to fill my time, but it wasn't until my firstborn daughter actually started primary school herself. And on her first day going into school, even though I'd pre-warned them that she was vegan, they told me that they weren't going to provide a lunch for her. And I was crying around the supermarket, getting a quick pack lunch, thinking, my daughter is the most compassionate, kind, and loving girl. And I think she's being discriminated. I think, and all these things were going, I wasn't aware of the Human Rights Act and any protections that we had at that point. And I was just thinking, I think I've been discriminated against, and I wasn't sure, and I didn't know. And thankfully, I had some friends at the council where I live. And so I questioned this, and then they helped me to work with them to create the UK's first rolling vegan menu in her school. And I thought, oh, I'm a bit of a powerhouse. Look at me, knowing what I'd known from being a teacher and knowing that every child matters. And then I thought, I have these people, friends of mine, who have some influence, and I started just to think quite a lot again as well about how am I able to sit comfortably knowing that my daughter is about to learn a curriculum that I wasn't able to teach. And so I actually started doing the work that I am for the Vegan Society now in a consultancy position, just me on my own. I named myself Primary Veducation. And it was a free service, this training and resource building and supporting other parents on Facebook and other social media platforms to say, if you're having an issue with food, perhaps I can talk you through my journey, and you can maybe do the same and advocate for yourself and for your family. And so for me, it was basically, I became vegan for the animals. And I knew that from the moment I'd learned about the mistreatment of animals and non-human animals and the planet, I knew I was vegan for life. But I had no idea at that point that I would become kind of the cornerstone of pushing forward a humane education agenda and essentially theorizing vegan inclusive education.
Yeah. Fascinating. And it'll be interesting to understand your story of how you got there. But I can imagine that sense of, hold on, are we being discriminated against must have been quite alien, because in a way we're very used to the idea of discrimination around race or sex or sexuality or being trans, or there's a bunch of different ways that, you're aware of those types of discrimination very clearly. But to be discriminated against because of your worldview seems to be something distinct. And of course, we do see that in worldview bigotry and people being bigoted against people with different religious worldviews. But yeah, to then realize that there's actually a discrimination against a worldview that is itself intrinsically about extending compassion, just must have been a bewildering feeling.
To live through that was actually mind-boggling. And I think that's what that was the catalyst for me doing something so big and focusing all my attention onto that, because I don't even think that I fully understood at that time, as was evident at me questioning, have I been discriminated against, kind of what was happening. I mean, I think at this time as well, it's almost a decade ago now, and veganism didn't have that trend of people understanding it. It was There weren't menus, all these big corporations weren't bringing vegan things in. It was very much, I felt like I was by myself on my own, feeling as though everything that I had ever known about myself, my identity, my life, what kind of mother I thought I would be, what kind of teacher I thought, all of these things were just completely flipped on their head. And I had to find a voice within this gigantic world where I believed I was the only vegan in the village, and who on earth would listen to me? Who on earth would care? And this is before I'd even found a vegan community. I mean, the work that I started to do with primary Veducation, when I first put something out there on the internet saying, do any other parents think that they would like my support? And it was, whoa, okay, so all of you. That was the first time that I'd really only realized that actually it's not just me. I'm not just shouting in this echo chamber. My entire life, everything I believe, everything I've been taught by people who I respected, my parents, my teachers, religious leaders, all of these people had told me that one thing was correct. And I had to now navigate the fact that I deeply, genuinely believed that it wasn't. And I'm now advocating for my daughter as well in this circumstance where everything felt undone. It was, bewildering. And I'm glad that I was able to have the strength and the support to navigate my way through it. And actually, something good has come out of it, because it did feel utterly heartbreaking at the time.
It must have done. Yeah, now you're helping many others. So let's wind the clock back, I guess, and go into these foundational philosophical questions. And the first one is this question about epistemology, I guess, and how we come to know things, this question of what's real. And there are so many different topics we could cover there, but one that often is a good way into it is to understand whether people grew up originally in more of a culture and a society and a family that was maybe more religious or supernatural or spiritual in some way, or was already quite naturalistic or atheistic or agnostic, naturalistically minded, if you like, or something else, and how that side of their thinking has changed over time, if it has. So yeah, if you want to wind the clock back and tell us the story about, I guess that side of your worldview, it would be fascinating.
In the beginning.
Yeah.
In the beginning, God made me Jewish. I was born into a Jewish family. My father and all of my paternal grandparents, and as far back as we could trace, were all born Jewish. I'm Russian, Latvian, Irish, British, English. So the Russian, Latvian side of things is all my paternal side. My mother was born Jewish to a Jewish father, but my maternal grandmother, actually was born Christian and converted to Judaism to marry my Jewish grandfather. So I think that's where although I do have a bit of Latvian, Eastern European look within me, I think I've got the Irish from my grandmother. But once she converted to Judaism in her late 30s, I think it was, they were very much a Jewish family. She put a lot of effort and a lot of emphasis on being the perfect Jewish housewife, the perfect Jewish mother. And so when my mother was born, even though she has my colorings and I have her colorings, and we didn't really fit in looks wise with the Jewish school that I went to, I always felt a little bit like, why do I look different to everybody else? They made a huge effort of us I was the only one who both went to the synagogue on a Saturday morning and Sunday school. And I'd always ask the question, why is it that none of my friends are going to Sunday school? Why do I have to go to Cheder? I want to lie in. But it was my mother's way of really wanting to instill this Jewish identity in me, because I think perhaps maybe she felt growing up as though she wasn't fully Jewish. And then when my older brother and I were actually enrolled at the Jewish school that we went to in our area, my parents had a little bit of a problem with them being almost a more orthodox school and not really seeing us as 100% Jewish. And so I think my mum had a little bit of a complex about that. And so essentially wanted my brother and I to be the most Jewish we could possibly be so that we could fit in. His colorings were slightly more towards that anyway. He can tan. And we both went to the Jewish school for primary. We both went to Cheder. We both had bat mitzvahs. He had a bar mitzvah. But then as we both have grown older, religion has definitely becomes something that neither of us would probably put as something we are particularly driven by anymore. My brother, I think he classes himself as atheist now. And he has 3 children who don't follow any religion at all. And my daughters have an awareness that they're Jewish because I'm married to their father is a Jewish man who comes from Jewish lineage, and they're very relaxed about it. They don't practice so much. They just do the festivals. My daughter has said that she would like to have a bat mitzvah. She's coming up to 11 now, so we asked her. But do I think that's driven by the religious side of things, or perhaps by the fact that she'll get a party bus? I don't know. I like being part of the Jewish community in so much as I know that there's always going to be a community who I grew up with who, if needed, would always support me. I do like having that safety net. And I do like some aspects of the tradition and the culture and the food because it's familiar. But do I think religion is something that is of great importance to me at the moment? Probably not. It's just that background part of my identity.
Yeah, thank you. And it's fascinating, I think, in many different religious communities, but it's something, particularly distinctive about Judaism, where it isn't just a religion, right? It's a people as well, and a community and so on. And my understanding of it from the stats and from some of the conversations I've had is it's remarkably common to find, people who are very committed to the Jewish community and a Jewish culture and a Jewish background who don't actually have any of the supernatural or religious beliefs at all. And it's remarkably common within the community and the group. And how do you think about those, I guess, the supernatural aspects, those sort of core religious beliefs? Is that what's faded away in importance to you, but the culture and community is still important? Or how do you come to think about, things like the existence of a God? And
yeah, I mean, I feel as though a lot of the people who I grew up just have blind faith and don't question. My mother is one of them. Just absolute blind faith. God did this. God created that. We live the way that the 10 Commandments tell us to. Anything other than that is just outrageous. We are a people who have been discriminated against, and we are a people who are strong. We need each other, and we just follow the rules and we don't question. I've found that a lot. And I think that's why I've outgrown a lot of my friends from school, just purely because they don't ask these questions, they don't have these conversations. It's just blind faith. But sometimes ignorance is bliss. I mean, wouldn't it be lovely wouldn't it just be absolutely gorgeous to grow up in a world where you believe what you were taught and you are perfectly happy with that and don't have to question anything or take blue or red pills. It just is what it is. I think it's quite gorgeous to witness people who do have that, actually. Aren't you worried that you're going to die one day? Well, no, because God. Aren't you concerned about this or that? Well, no, because God will lead me there. It seems like a lovely thing to have belief. And I think when you have belief and the culture is so warm and loving and fun and built around celebration, it seems to me that, it's just a safe, kind, supported place to be. And I think before I became vegan and before I felt as though the entire world had been lying to me, I was already starting to question, did Noah's Ark really have these animals? Was the Red Sea really parted? They seemed too much to be stories to me to have any real truth about them. But I couldn't really find anybody in my own community to talk to about these things because, like I said, they all had that blind faith. And so when I went off to college and uni, I rarely spoke about it at all. In fact, my party trick at university, if we'd had a couple of sherbets, was I can write your name in Hebrew. Let me write your name in Hebrew. And it would just astonish people that I was able to read and write in fluent Hebrew. And it'd be just this weird thing because I didn't talk about religion, refer to my religion. It wasn't part of my life at all, but yet I still had this skill to write.
So the Sunday school paid off in the end.
Yeah, it's So, I just think that, like you say, people who are part of the Jewish community, they have that blind faith, and that's what drives them happily.
Yeah, thank you. And for many of my guests who've moved away from a religious worldview, even if they're still part of a religious community and have that identity, for some of them it was more of the facts and the evidence and the reasoning stuff. As you say, did this really happen to Noah? And, do these stories really make sense? So it was a more of an analytical thing of just going, the story just doesn't really feel like it's likely to be true to me anymore. And for other people, it was sometimes a little bit about the next question will come on to the questions of ethics, where they were saying, well, there's obviously lots of good stuff in this religious worldview, whatever it is, right? There's a compassionate God, and there's the golden rule and loving their neighbor as thyself, or, the different versions in the different religions. And there's a strong theme of compassion that runs through all of them. But then they would spot some problems too. And it might be sexism, or it might be bigotry against people with other worldviews, or people who'd left the religion, or certain behaviors. Did you see any of those types of issues that were part of your drift away from the more religious aspects? Or
I think so. I think you've hit the nail on the head. The hypocrisy for me, it was just becoming too stark. I was lucky. See, I don't know if my parents would agree that I was lucky growing up as a Reformed Jew, because Reformed Jewish part of the religion is more progressive, more forward thinking. So I would sit at my synagogue, men and women together. They would encourage children to come and play at the front. My rabbi is female and vegan.
radical?
She and I had a conversation, and it's that hypocrisy that I pointed out to her. Well, she'd once did a sermon on being kind to animals, and I emailed her straight after. But if I go to a synagogue where the majority of my friends from school went, the women would have to sit upstairs. And I am very much a person who likes the idea of inclusion, diversity, and I just couldn't understand why the women were shaving their heads and wearing shaitels and sat upstairs, and why they still had to play this role of mother, and didn't, I was thinking, where's all their ambition? And I just found myself questioning a lot all of the time. How can we be the kosher rule, for example, where at the same meal, at the same table, you're not allowed to have meat and milk, because somebody way back when they made this rule up, had decided that it wasn't fair to mix the meat of the mother with the milk of the intended calf at the same table. And I'm thinking, you're so close. You're so close. Like,
that's not quite the problem, but there's
someone somewhere has had the thought that it's a little bit crazy to separate the mother from that child, but it's just, and they come so close, but it's just not, it just wasn't quite there. And so it was that hypocrisy. Here we're celebrating life by having a burnt egg on the table. Here we're celebrating life, and we're expected to eat lamb chops. And there were just too many questions all of the time about these traditions and what was happening, and why wasn't anybody thinking more about compassion for the non-human animal? But I went vegetarian when I was 11 years old, actually. So from the age of my bat mitzvah at 12 up until I became vegan at 30, it was very much, I was always thinking about this, always.
Yeah. And that's an interesting angle, because for most of my guests, there's vegan journey and journey of thinking about animal ethics came after their move away from a religious worldview. So when they were spotting, some of the ethical issues within a religious worldview, they were mostly intrahuman stuff. But it's interesting that because your journey started much earlier than that, you're already starting to think about, the animal issue, the non-human animal issue, as part of you're challenging some of the religious views you are seeing too. So
yeah, because my instructions were coming from mouths of people who I respected. The male rabbi who I had for my entire life until our female rabbi came in recently, he also married my parents and my grandparents. He'd been there forever. And I respected everything that he said. And I went to a Jewish school, and And I respected everything that my teachers said and my parents, and everything that was coming from everybody who I respected and who was religious didn't make sense to me. I became vegetarian. It was so unheard of at the age of 11. And my friends used to call me Laura the lawyer. Here she is. I remember doing a speech about fox hunting at the front of the class, and my nickname was Laura the lawyer after that, because they just thought that, I was the only person they knew who would stand up for someone or something, other than, whatever we were told to do in class. It was something out there, and I was prepared to do it. And
where did that come from? Because that's really, I guess, the core of the second question about, what matters, what are right and wrong and good and bad even mean. And you were hinting at ideas of inclusion and diversity, and there's clearly some grounding of compassion there. But many people would restrict that to humans, and sometimes to in-group humans as well. So what was your journey to, I guess, both, what did you think good and bad and right and wrong meant? Did you have some intuitive childlike sense of what those things were? And how do you come to extend that to...
I genuinely believe that every human is born with an intrinsic love and compassion for everyone and everything around them. Non-human animals, big and small, each other, themselves, and the planet. And then we're corrupt.
And I'm quite drawn to that, partly because I just have this sort of naively optimistic mindset that I think you and I might share. But, and I don't want to stop you, but there are examples, of course, of small boys pulling the wings off flies and so on. So that, I find myself drawn to sort of wanting to think about, we're all pure and perfect as children, but I'm not sure that's quite true. Would you qualify that at all? Or do you think there's...
I talk about it in my training. So when I'm in a room full of teachers and I'm explaining to them about the fact that what I'm asking them to do is just create a more humane curriculum, I use example A and example B of two children. If child A spots a spider on the floor and immediately stomps, kills, murders, hates, and then shows off about it, or you have child B who scoops it into a cup and gently places it out in the garden out of harm's way. Wouldn't we want to harness and love and just reward this child whilst being concerned about that child? So I believe that exists, that there are children who will immediately, automatically want to perhaps kill or pull off the wings. But I believe it's because they've probably witnessed others do that. I don't believe that they naturally just want to do that. I feel they may have had an older sibling, they've witnessed it, and they've just missed out on that humane education. They've missed out on somebody saying, look how that child did it. Put yourself in the shoes of that spider. Wouldn't you want that? And nurtured that child into thinking more that way. I feel genuinely we're all intrinsically born with it. I just feel we're corrupted. We either witness the pain and the suffering, and then we build this cognitive dissonance around it, and it's not my problem, and forget it and don't care. Or we catch them early enough. And this is my absolute drive for pushing forward the humane education curriculum, is because if we don't catch them young enough, just to keep what I believe is already intrinsically there from getting corrupted, then it just does, and it goes, and it happens from a very early age.
So what went wrong with you then? Why didn't the corruption work?
So it did for a short period of time. I mean, before the age of 11, I was eating animals, and I would scream to my father to get rid of the spiders in my house, kill it, kill it, kill it. Because I'd witnessed teachers doing that. I'd witnessed people doing it. I thought it was normal, natural, necessary to use and abuse animals in any which way that seemed fit to me. I had an ego. I didn't know much about the world. And then eventually, when the ego softens and you learn more about the world, and I suppose my natural intrinsic love for non-human animals was just, it became more powerful. It just took over my thinking. I'm one of the lucky ones, I think. because I think my actions are in line with my beliefs.
And was there a particular turning point at 11 when you went vegetarian, or was it more of a gradual thing?
Yes. My late grandmother offered me a tongue sandwich. And I said, Grandma, that's a peculiar name for a sandwich. And that was it. When she explained to me why it was called tongue, I couldn't unsee or unfeel what I'd felt that day. I don't know how other people can eat non-human animals, to be perfectly honest. To me, it's an alien concept.
It's bizarre, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, that's one example that is, there are so many, but that's one example that's really viscerally going to bring it to you, right?
Yeah, the fact that it's an actual tongue. Because had she said, would you like a beef sandwich? I probably would have said yes, and I wouldn't have thought anything of it.
What was the response of family and friends and those around you? I mean, clearly you were you probably had your lawyerly head on and were pretty determined to carry it through, but what sort of resistance or support did you get?
My mum, to her credit, became vegetarian at the same time that I did, because she'd also had these thoughts and feelings, but didn't feel supported enough to actually follow through on becoming a vegetarian. She'd also read a really lovely book, something along the lines of Being Kind to Animals. Can't remember the title just now, but she was working in pharmacy and beauty. She'd been a beautician and worked in medicinal areas of the sector, and she was thinking about, testing on animals. And so I think she and I did it together. So I was lucky enough to have that support she'd never had. But that was it really. It was just the two of us. Nobody else who we knew was vegetarian for many, many years. But then when I became vegan, so did she. And so did my brother and his wife and their children and my first cousin on my mum's side. And we're pretty much all a big gang of, there's just a couple of us now who are flexitarian or vegetarian on and off. But
that's awesome that so many people, went with you. So, yeah.
Yeah. Along the way. But, funny enough, my brother did it more for health and environmental reasons, has come around to the fact that it's kinder and more compassionate. So we've all gone on these journeys, but we've all kind of come to the same place, which I never would have imagined when I was 11 years old and doing this. But without my mom, I don't think I probably would have been able to, because my friends were not very supportive, my school not very supportive. And obviously restaurants and the wider world not very supportive back then either. So I had credit to the diehard vegans who were doing that, in the 70s and 80s and whatnot. When I say I became vegan before the curve. Wow, they really went for it. I didn't even know what a vegan was when I was 11 and vegetarian. Otherwise, I may have gone straight to that. But the journey happens as it does, and here we are.
Yeah, some of my guests went vegan in the 70s, and they're having to mix their own soy milk powder and properly heroic. Yeah, I'm so lucky. Well, I mean, particularly living where we do these days, and in 2024, it's a completely different world. So
it sure is. And going back to what you mentioned at the very start of the question about good and bad people, I can't for the life of me fathom why or how people can eat an animal. I honestly cannot. I cannot fathom why people or how people can eat something that's fallen out of a waste product from an animal. But I remember being in training about a year or two ago now, where a teacher at the Q&A session said to me at the end, "Do you think that my children are bad people because they eat animals?" And I said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. The way that we're brought up, the way that the marketing works, the way that society is, the way that we've lived for generation after generation after generation. I said, I don't think that anyone is good or bad because of the life choices that they make. I just think for me and for my daughters, it's very black and white. We either cause harm or we don't. We're either compassionate or we're not. And I just think that a lot of people are stuck in a grey area where they perhaps haven't had the right education or the right experiences, and their cognitive dissonance is strong because they are still listening to people, religious people or parents or educators who are saying that these things are okay. And And so I always go into doing my training with that viewpoint of, I've been in a position where I've eaten animals and I loved it. Turkey was my favorite meat. When October, November used to come around and all the turkeys used to come in the shop, I used to lick my lips. I used to love it. Love it. And when I became vegetarian, cheese, loved it. And I just genuinely think that it's not that people are good or bad. I also talk about the way that our education system is and the fact that children learn from the early years about animal farming and how lovely it is. And they have chick hatcheries come in and butterfly hatcheries, and they go and visit zoos. And from such an early age, the use and abuse of animals is used so much in our education system that it's absolutely I have no question that generation after generation can't even understand veganism as a concept because of that constant messaging of it's okay. Use them, it's okay, they're here for us, go for it, use it. And so I think we are all born with an intrinsic love for non-human animals, ourselves, each other, the planet. I think we are genuinely born with it, but we're corrupted. And so there aren't good people or bad people. It's just how much are you listening to of the bad message?
I agree. It's so rare to find someone who will explicitly and clearly and deliberately say, I don't care about non-human animals. I just exclude them from my moral consideration. Now, there are some people like that, and, I bump into people, particularly as a vocal vegan on Twitter, right? There are people who will revel in doing that and being essentially immoral and to push it in your face. I'm not sure many of those people are really serious, or many of them aren't even real people, right? But that's quite rare. In a way, most humans, I think, share our ethics, at least in theory, in that who would want to needlessly cause exploitation, suffering, or death to any sentient being, human or not? I mean, that would be quite unusual ethical stance to take, just to say, look, this is okay, it's good. I think most people agree that we should try and avoid that where we can. But as you said, it's a combination of, the things that are hidden, going back to the epistemology question, the lies that people are told, the marketing, but very strongly those social norms, the authority figures and what is normal. And we're social animals that, to be honest, more understandably, maybe more interested in fitting in than we are in really understanding the truth sometimes. So that's partly why I find these subjects really interesting, because yes, there are ethical problems. There are people who are deliberately anthropocentric and would exclude non-humans, but actually the problem seems much more one of social norms and epistemology, and the things you have to believe to think that consuming animal products is ethical. I mean, you have to believe some crazy stuff, right? You have to believe that either animals aren't sentient and can't suffer, or that farming doesn't cause them harm, or that we can't survive without them. And I think those epistemological errors are often much more of the issue than people just saying, I just don't care about animals. Because as you say, nearly everybody does. So.
Absolutely. I wrote in my book about a conversation I'd had with my niece where she said to me something along the lines of, animals don't feel pain when you kill them because the shochet goes from one side to the other really quickly. And I thought, oh, my poor darling gorgeous niece. I don't want to sit here and explain something different to you because I don't want to scar you. It's an awful position. I would just like to spread the truth and the compassion and make it black and white and try my best to just close down the grey. But I also think a lot of those people who you've mentioned on Twitter are just being antagonizing you. They're, they're just ruffling feathers because they're just bored or want to upset you or wind you up. I guess if you put a pig and a knife in front of them, that's when they would show their true colors. Could they actually, there's one thing to not care about them, but it's another thing to actually harm. So I'd like to give, see the experiment on those people who've chosen to purposely antagonize you and say, well,
yeah,
could you?
Too right. Now, one other interesting part of this who matters question is that some people will criticize veganism, but they'll also criticize sentientism and say, look, you're not going far enough. And one of the first times the word sentientism was used was as a criticism by people who were saying, if you care about animals because they can feel pain and they can flourish, they can have experiences, aren't you discriminating against all of the things in the world that aren't sentient, plants and fungi that are living but probably not sentient, or even beyond that, ecosystems and rocks and rivers and trees. So some people think of this sort of scale of moral consideration where you've got anthropocentrism, centered on humans. And obviously some people are even narrower than that because they only care about their own in-group, let alone all humans, right? So even getting to universal human compassion is pretty challenging for many humans. But then where I am is the next stage of sentiocentrism that says that every being that can experience anything at all warrants serious compassion and moral consideration. And that's what motivates my veganism ultimately. But then some people do go further. They go into biocentrism or ecocentrism, where they say, look, all living things should matter. Even if a plant can't experience pain, they still matter intrinsically morally. And, maybe rivers should have rights to keep them clean, right? Maybe even rivers, rocks, and ecosystems matter. What do you think about those types of worldviews that go even beyond the animal kingdom and beyond sentience?
Yeah, well, I'm just glad that there are people advocating for nature. It's in dire straits, and there is very little respect for the fact that we're all interconnected. There's, why should we care about the bees? Well, we all know we don't all know how important they are. That's the problem, the insects who are working below our feet, who we rarely think about from our day to day. Even someone like myself who's advocating for all animals, big and small, they are working away, doing their thing, and alongside the fungi, alongside the roots of the trees and the plants, and they're all in dire straits with the pesticides and the pollution. And it's but I'm a strong believer in the fact that we're all connected, we're all energy sources, the circle of life, etc., etc. And I even within the vegan world, there are people who are, so my corner is education. Then there'll be another, the plant-based health professionals. Their corner is health. And I always say, because I think very much about effective altruism, I've only got so much time and effort and money and energy to spend, so I'm going to craft this area. But I know without all of those other people doing what they are in different sectors, highlighting various other problems, then it wouldn't be a movement at all. It wouldn't. And so we need, I believe, all of those people contributing towards veganism to make it that movement that it is. So very much with regards to people who are advocating for rivers, I'm grateful that they are. When you look back at the way that we used to respect rivers and have, I can't name any tribes people right now. It's something that I might have to do some reading and research on for the future. But, where I can imagine that they would have had ceremonies giving back to the rivers, and perhaps that's just Hollywood feeding that to me, but I believe that that will have happened, where people would have given back to forests and people would have given back to insects and had ceremonies, and that's gone completely.
Yeah, there's a sense of a reverence and a relationship.
Yeah, that you take from me and I'll give back to you, and we are one. We will work together to keep moving in a healthy, happy, respectful way. And it's just, when you look at the amount of plastic in the ocean as one example, if you look at just how devastating it is to see a football pitch every second of rainforest disappearing, and all of these things that I can't think too much about because I will explode. It's where effective altruism comes in very, very useful. I'm in my corner of the world doing my education thing, pushing forward the agenda for a humane education. And I'm just so grateful and so glad that people like you are having conversations with other people in those fields who are pushing that forward, because there aren't enough of us making enough noise We're not winning currently, but I'd like to think that we will eventually when our voices join up. And this is why I'm grateful that we did speak at VegFest, and here we are now, and and hopefully that will reverberate out and we can all support each other.
Sounds good to me. And let's come on to the final question. It's a perfect link really into, how can we make a better future? And as you've said, sometimes it can be a little overwhelming because there's so many different problems, environmental, intrahuman problems, wars, famine, poverty. And then when we broaden our moral scope out to all sentient beings, you can think about wild animals being exploited by humans. The scope of the problems just gets even broader, and it can be a bit mind-blowing, right? It's hard enough for the average human to get your head around 8 billion humans, many of whom are suffering. But when you then explode that to hundreds of billions or maybe even trillions of exploited animals, and maybe quadrillions or quintillions of animals living free-ranging in the wild, even beyond human influence, again, it's just too much for the human brain to conceive of. And in a way, that's partly one of why I've ended up trying to prioritize this worldview idea, because the idea is, look, that's almost too much to engage in. There's so many different causes, but often with those causes, humans are either the problem or the potential solution. So if we can just nudge human values to have a slightly better grounded epistemology that's more close to reality, so that we might have a chance of understanding what's going on and what we should do to the world. But also, if we can have a moral scope that includes every being that has the capacity to suffer, so that no suffering being is excluded, that won't magically solve all of those problems, but at least it gives us a better chance of addressing all of them. So in a way, it's quite a robust sort of foundational attempt to try and shift human worldviews in a positive direction, because frankly, we've got all the power. So, and in a way, your work is absolutely centered in a similar space. And as you were saying, you and I also share this sense that, young humans, when I'm talking in schools about sentientism and veganism, quite often I will say, look, if you imagine your younger brother or sister 2 or 3 years old, do they really have an epistemology? Do they really have ethics? I mean, who knows, right? But they are exploring the world honestly, trying to understand it, using their senses, learning things, trying to appreciate what's going on around them. They're using evidence and reason in a rudimentary sense to try and work things out. And I agree that they also have that sense of compassion, not just for family and friends around them, but beyond that and across the species boundary as well, that people, you detect that another being is suffering and you feel sad for them. That compassion is almost like part of the raw material of what it is to be human. But then our society and family and the education system take us away from those things. Often we're told fabrications, but we're also told, I think, broken ways of believing, trust this authority unquestionably, or, have this blind faith. It's not just being taught things that I think are wrong, it's being taught poor ways of thinking that take us away from an understanding of reality. But then we're also taught constrained compassion. We're taught, oh no, those people are different from us. We don't, think about them the same way. They're different. There's something wrong. They're an out group. And absolutely with non-human animals, our exploitation is just so totally normalized at such an industrial scale that it's quite hard to intellectually get your head around that. So in a weird way, there's a positive opportunity for education. We could do so much by just not doing bad education, right? If you could just strip out the bad education and let kids develop, as they are, that would be 90% of the problem.
That's my tagline.
Perfect. Well,
education.
I should stop rambling on. So yeah, we could talk about anything you like in this how to make a better future thing, but your focus is about education systems and so on. So how do you think about that space, and how can we fix it all?
Oh, amazing. I'm going to get a hat, don't do bad education, written on it. I love that.
It's a new logo, yeah.
I mean, a lot to unpick there, and I agree with everything that you've said. It's like I've said, we have to just get the youth while they are young. So what I do is I promote a humane curriculum that celebrates non-human animals but doesn't use non-human animals. So yes, as a teacher, please use animals as a muse to teach key skills through. But don't bring them into class and don't take them on trips to see them caged. Let's teach children about compassion for non-human animals in the correct way. So build a tree house for a bird and talk about, perhaps get a webcam in there and talk about the bond between a bird and chick. Don't bring in a box with a bunch of chicks in where they're going to be hatched without the warmth of their mother with a light bulb. It's unfathomable to me that is seen as good education, because they will learn about that. And so I've written curriculums, medium-term plans, long-term plans to encourage educators to just see things from the animal's point of view. What is the best way that we can learn about them? When you think about dinosaurs, children have never met a dinosaur, yet if you teach about a dinosaur correctly, you will see awe and wonder in the faces of the children. So they never need to see a zebra up close. They never need to see a hippopotamus up close. You don't need to drag them to a zoo to see them in these unnatural habitats. If you're a good enough teacher, you can create that same awe and wonder that you have done with learning about dinosaurs as you can do with these wild animals. And so it's about just explaining, again, using the example of child A and child B, about how educators have the power to foster that innate love, that compassion, that beautiful thing that I believe all children are born with, if they're teaching a humane curriculum. And it's usually simple tweaks. When they're baking or cooking, just use a plant-based recipe. And, we have to talk about, this is the future. This is not happening right now, thinking about everybody having this lovely humane curriculum. But for now, things just need to be plural. They need to be unbiased. So I just talk about, if you're going to use eggs in that recipe, for example, then talk about how you can use something else in a different plant-based recipe and just make sure it's unbiased. And just, when you're talking about farm animals, how about you refer to them as animals who are farmed as opposed to farm animals? Because it's an unnatural habitat. And with the world being in such dire straits at the moment everywhere, wouldn't it be more beneficial for children to learn about natural habitats and how to protect those natural habitats than to spend money taking them to an aquarium, an unnatural habitat where they're not going to learn about anything really important? They're just going for that wow moment, which, again, like I've said, if you're a good enough teacher, you can create in your own classroom. And I love the idea, love the idea of children being taught compassion and empathy. And they do sometimes have those lessons, but it's a half an hour or an hour at the end of the day, and it's not really based on anything that will give them a life skill. The PSHE curriculum, it should run all the way through everything that is taught. And things like nursery rhymes, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, once I caught a fish alive, 3 blind mice, chop off their tails with a carving knife, Old MacDonald and his make-believe farm. It's just relentless and endless, the amount of things that are going on in our classrooms from such a early age, from entry level. And, it's Easter at the moment. There's all sorts going on and happening at my daughter's nursery. And I just think if educators all around the world just stopped teaching the curriculum that they have been doing since the Victorian age, which is outdated, irrelevant, and started thinking about what are the problems in the world? How can we fix them? How can simple things like our nursery rhymes, our language use, it's more than one way to skin a cat, all these horrible idiots, all these things that are being used constantly that just keep sending out that message over and over again that animals are here for us, not with us.
It's such a deep and pervasive intervention and change that's required, because I think for some people, if you talked about the idea of introducing veganism into education, they might think of it as something you add on to the side, or they might think that it's quite specific and focused. It's about what's available for lunch, or the catering, or where do you go on a school trip, or do you dissect a frog in biology, right? And they think it was, but what you're talking about here is about a fundamental philosophical shift that impacts language, nursery rhymes, stories, trips, and the curriculum are probably of every subject, right?
In its
You could think
entirety.
about history, geography. You could go through the entire curriculum and think about this shift that's required. In addition to, as you said, actually talking about ethics and values as an important subject to address in its own right. Whereas at the moment, as you say, you might get a civics class or a PSHE class, or it might be squeezed into religious education and philosophy, or religious and worldviews education somewhere.
Yeah, I genuinely believe that it is time for humane education to step up, and the big players in the humane education field actually start getting into politics and rubbing shoulders with Department for Educations and selling this idea that we need to start again. We need to start again completely. The thing is more often than not, they're easy tweaks. Whenever I go in and I say, look, I'd like you to become vegan inclusive, but it's your choice. I'll tell you how, I'll show you how, and I'll create resources. I always refer to the fact that it's just little tweaks, little things that you say and do, and trips that you go on, and just, it is, from the outside looking in, a huge curriculum overhaul from the roots upwards. But in actual fact, in practice, for the educators who will be delivering it, it is just simple tweaks. And I was able to write my book on this. When I was doing my primary Veducation, my book has a very catchy title. It's called An Educator's Guide for Vegan Inclusive Teaching. And I just took every single aspect, like you said, of teaching, the education, the curriculum, the school ethos, policy, leadership, and then the food also, lunches, and just pretty much said, this is how non-human animals are used and abused throughout. And perhaps if we didn't do that, you'd be raising more compassionate children. Would that be so terrible? And, to me, saying it like that, it seems like such an easy, simple, to me, it seems, if I can write a book on the subject, it's an easy subject. Just, if I can theorize, that's how I felt. Like, if I'm just a mum, if I'm just a teacher and a mum from Manchester in England, and I can see how detrimental it is to our world, it should be so easy for policymakers, the Department for Education, to jump on board with this.
It's the weird thing, isn't it? Once that you've made that fundamental mind shift, it just becomes pretty obvious, right? I mean, it's not rocket science. And from the work I do in schools, it's fascinating because nearly all schools will have, as you say, a sort of a charter or vision or a mission statement, or they'll have, their principles up on the wall that they want to inculcate into their kids. And I can't think of one that doesn't have something about compassion and caring in there, right? So in a sense, all we're asking is let's put that into practice in a consistent, coherent way that doesn't exclude any beings. Yeah.
Do it properly. They're putting the plaster over the problem and not going to the root cause. There will always be war. There will always be fighting. Maybe this utopian world that I'm envisaging doesn't exist and I'm naive, whatever, perhaps. But also, it might very well be that this revolution in education, humane, I'm not the founder of the humane education movement. It's been around, and there are people out there, Zoe Weil, who I know you've spoken to, who have been doing this before I was born. But I don't feel, and especially this is a whole different subject, but with artificial intelligence becoming more prominent in people's lives now, I feel like the humane education community needs to really step up, because we're just, like you said, it just seems so easy. Stop putting plasters over the problem and actually get to the root cause. and fix it. I'll do it. I don't mind. I will go into the Department of Education. I will do it.
I think, how many education secretaries have we had in the last 14 years? Anyway, I've lost count. I'm not sure I could count that high, but I'd vote for you as the next one.
Thank you.
In a shot.
You're very kind.
And what I'm interested in what sort of response you've had and how that response is changing over time from children themselves, from teachers, from people who run schools, headmistresses and headmasters, from the wider education community. What sort of response do you get? Because in a way, like you say, yeah, it's easy and it's straightforward, but it is also quite radical and quite far-reaching and touches many aspects of what schools have come to think of as normal. So how do people respond? And do you have to get your loyally tone, engaged?
I would love to sit here and say to you that what I'm doing is having a great impact. I think this is probably where my frustrations with the Humane education community lies, is because it's difficult to say. I'm not having as much of an impact as I would like, just being me working for one organisation in one part of the world.
There's only so many hours in the day.
Yeah. I am getting good feedback from other vegan parents who I've advocated for and who recommend me, word of mouth. I feel that vegan parents feel more empowered because of the work that I've done to kick up a fuss and fight for their rights, basically, if they've been, directly or indirectly discriminated against. So in that respect, I feel as though there is stuff happening, and my book is still being purchased every now and then. So people are still reading it, and the schools I've been into, I do an annual checkup to see how things are going. And yes, they've had the training, but is it always at the forefront of their mind? No. Once the vegan child is out of their class, are they still going to deliver a humane curriculum? Probably not. I feel as though I need to do a lot more work in policy, perhaps get into politics, do that route changing myself, because even though I've now started to create the online CPD course that educators around the world can take in vegan inclusion, it's without somebody larger and more important and more influential than little old me saying, you have to do this, it won't be done. The food, for example, the grey area in this country is that schools do not have to provide vegan food. It's not in the standards. But if a school chooses not to, then they're not complying with the public sector equality duty. So we say, look, we know that the school food standard says you don't have to, but the public sector equality says that you probably should. It's up to you to decide. Well, what kind of wishy-washy message is that? It's outrageous. Because I have to advocate and stand up for parents, and I'll write letters and I'll speak to catering companies, and my incredible colleague Jeanette Rowley will do the same. We will perhaps sometimes get some good results, which feels great. But, then we'll get another email a week later saying, my school really won't do this, and there's nothing more we can do. We can help, and we can shout about public sector equality duty, and we can shout about the fact that veganism attracts the same protections from the Human Rights Act as a religious person would, and we can scream it from the rooftops. But essentially, because of that wishy-washy grey area, there is, why would a school comply? Why would a school make life more difficult for themselves?
And they're under so much pressure anyway. It's,
Yeah, it's ridiculous, the amount of pressure that teachers and head teachers are under. I would never, ever, ever downplay the work that they are doing, because they are incredible people doing a hard job in very difficult circumstances. And the majority of them are very kind, compassionate, loving people who just want the best for their children in their care. But I want this great change, and I go in all enthusiastic, and I provide them with the resources, and I have to just hope for the best, because then my time and energy and effort is pulled elsewhere with other new cases that have come in who need my support. And so as much as I love my job and I feel that it is having some effect in some places, I mean, it must be, because I'm invited to speak at events and APPGs and things like that, which is great, because obviously they're the people who I want to be influencing. There's still so very, very much to do, so much to do. I think perhaps once my CPD online training has been released and is open to anyone in the world, and we maybe do a big media push, and it perhaps becomes a resource that becomes more prominent in schools as the community grows and as veganism grows, because it is growing exponentially, there's no denying that. Maybe it's something that further down the line I won't live to see the benefit of, but people who plant seeds to not shade in its leaves are the ones who perhaps are mad enough to get stuff done. And I'm perhaps in that category because it's my passion. It's what I live, eat, breathe. So we shall see.
I think a little bit of madness helps. And it's in a way, it's challenging because it is such a deep-seated societal shift that we're trying to drive. And that can feel deeply frustrating because, like you say, you're one person and you're trying to change an entire society, and that's just the UK, right? Before we even think about it globally. But at the same time, the change we're trying to drive is so intuitively obvious that, I do think things could shift quite fast.
Yes. And also, I don't feel very much on my own at the moment either. There are other people popping up, Michelle from Vine, Ruth Jenkins, who made the vegan inclusive education map and pack. And there are other people. I mean, PETA have got an education division now. Viva have just hired an education officer. There are other charities and other people coming into the education realm. We've got the
Joining
amazing
your effort.
Well, yeah, we've got the amazing Pro-Veg School Plates program, the incredible Gary and Anna, who are down in Brighton, who were the first vegan catering company in a school. And so
plant-based school kitchens, yeah.
Yeah, the plant-based school kitchens and so on and so forth. You've got the amazing plant-based universities team who are branching into plant-based schools now. And so when I first wrote my book 1,000 years ago and thought, who is going to read this? Will it be useful? Am I just, in this echo chamber? Now that there is a community of us, and we do work together and are working together and are making noise. It's just all very slow. But I suppose, I'm just impatient because I want this so much. Like I said, it will all come. It will all come eventually, because sense has to prevail, Jamie. It just has to.
It does. And I think it will. We'll get there. And one other aspect we haven't touched on so much yet is the idea of teaching veganism itself as a worldview. And that's one of the things that obviously Michelle St. John and have worked for Vine Veganism in education is doing great work on. And in a way, my efforts to take Sentientism as a worldview into schools is similar, because we're actually trying to come into the issue and find spaces in the curriculum where kids are actually learning about worldviews and ways of understanding the world and values and ethics. And it can be tough because, like you said, PSHE and civics classes are pretty thin and far between. But one area that I've found really hopeful is actually the religious education space, because that is one place where these topics are directly addressed. I mean, that's in a way what it's for, is these deep questions. And before I started to get involved in it, I wasn't really sure what sort of response I'd get, but I've been really encouraged at, and maybe there's a bit of a selection effect, right? Because the people who want to talk to us, are the people who are probably best aligned with the way we're thinking. But that field has shifted from, a focus on quite a narrow set of religions. For example, here's Christianity and it's right, and you don't need to know about those other ones, to, okay, here's Christianity and then here's some others as well, to a more pluralistic approach that thinks about multiple religions, but also thinks about non-religious worldviews like humanism and sentientism and veganism, which can be from a religious or a non-religious perspective. And from many of the professionals in that space, there just seems to be a real openness to that sort of pluralism of thinking about different worldviews, even new, even quite radical worldviews, and to helping kids find their own way through these things, to explore using critical thinking, an evidence and reason-based approach to evaluate and work out how these worldviews work, find their own path, but appreciate others as well. And those ideas of compassion, and ultimately a sentiocentric compassion, a compassion that extends out beyond humans to non-human animals, are richly resonant in many of the different religious worldviews, of course, with ideas like ahimsa and the fact that, the Garden of Eden was apparently vegan. And, so whether you take a religious approach to this and then you extend that compassion out for various reasons, or you take a non-religious route through something like sentientism to, agree with that sentiocentric compassion, the people I've worked with so far in that field seem to be really open to that approach and to that idea of bringing these ideas really richly and deeply into the classroom. So I think that's another aspect of this broader, sort of vegan education system or a humane education system that will really help, because I think it cuts to the heart of why these things are important in the first place. It's not just, a different type of food at lunch, or it's not just visiting a sanctuary instead of a zoo. It's like, why is that important deep down? And ultimately it comes back to these things that most 5-year-old kids already know, which is you should care about others, and we should try and understand the world well if we want to make it better. So it's not rocket science, right? It's back to these basics.
Undoubtedly. And I'm absolutely delighted that you guys are out there doing that. Again, it's part of those corners that need filling in so that we're all, singing from the same hymn sheet, if you'll pardon the pun. But, but having been in education, having been a teacher, I know that if you've got an RE lesson scheduled for a Thursday afternoon and for some reason you're running over with maths, it'll just get left out. It's not seen as important. And not to poo-poo your work, because you're doing amazing work, and so is Michelle. It's just the pressures on teachers for the English and the maths are so big, and the science, that the humanities aren't seen as something greatly important. Now, there might be a child with a special need who struggles in maths and struggles in English and cannot wait for the RE lesson so that they can have these conversations and it doesn't rely on their ability to read or write. And for them, these lessons will be motivating and they'll be wonderful and so great. So let's just hope that they are happening and they are being taught correctly. Because then again, that's also another issue is, if I remember being a teacher and having a Mormon girl in my class and not really knowing what a Mormon was and having to do a bit of research, but was I an expert in Mormon worldviews by the end of that? No. Had I learned and done enough? No, nowhere near. Because was it the most important thing? I knew the basics. I knew how to be inclusive. I knew not to sing happy birthday near her. I knew how to approach her family if I had a question about something I was teaching about Christmas, for example. But and so I have to use that example when I go into schools, knowing the pressures teachers are under, knowing how the humanities get thrown out at the whim of a hat, knowing how teachers with the best will in the world want to be inclusive and want to learn, but if they're not taught correctly or don't have the right information or the right worksheets to work off and they've just downloaded some rubbish from somewhere that isn't the great thoughtful work that you or Michelle are creating, and there's just so many problems. And this is why this is what I was alluding to earlier when I said, it's just a half an hour at the end of the day that isn't as impactful as you'd like. There will always be the odd couple of children in that class who are really engaged and learning and loving it. And that's fine. That's lovely. But I do think, again, it's nice to have veganism on the curriculum. Great, brilliant. But I do genuinely just think it's more important that we kind of get that curriculum changed so that it runs through as a message.
It's only part of the picture. It can't just be, here's an add-on at the end.
But it's a great place to start.
Yeah, I think it's part of the picture, but it's only part. And one of the other encouraging things that I found is I think partly the religious education, or it's now being renamed often religious and worldviews education, or religion and values, or religion and philosophy. Part of the reason that shift is happening is because they recognize that often it isn't that appealing a subject for kids. Because if you are a very religious kid and it's important to you, you're not necessarily that interested in learning about the other religions. And if you're not a religious kid, which more than half of the UK aren't, the whole topic is just like lists of festivals and beliefs that I don't think are real. And it's like, how do I engage with it? But what kids love is they love the fundamentals of philosophy, right? If you ask them questions about how do we work out what's true? How sure should you be that that's true? And if you ask them questions about who should we care about? Why should we care about them? They're brilliant philosophers. I strongly maintain that the average 6-year-old is better at philosophy than the average adult on Twitter. although that's a low bar. And that's partly coming back to your optimism earlier on in that subject area, is that the buzz I get from being in a classroom working on these types of topics with even very young kids is absolutely mind-blowing. The quality of the questions, the freshness, the engagement, the excitement, the attention. That potential is there for us to just tap into. It's just latent, but we've got to have the right people and the right mindset and the right curriculum plug into that.
And isn't it so sad to think those same wonderful children who you will have spent an amazing hour or two with are being confined to the Victorian style method of teaching. It doesn't matter how fancy pants the whiteboard is or how interactive the fun lesson is. Essentially, it's just 30 children of different abilities and different interests, different stages of walks of life and histories and futures, all crammed together, learning the same curriculum on the same day.
Yeah, being churned through a process. Yeah.
Honestly, I cannot believe this is still what our education system looks like, even with all this talk of innovation and technology. And, I worked in Holland for a short while, and even just the open plan classroom where even at the age of 10, 11 years old, they got to choose which section they felt like working in. It was just like, yes, why are we still working this Victorian? Nothing is going to change.
Until your education secretary.
Until everything changes. Yeah.
Lawyer Laura for education secretary. I can see it in our near future.
Perhaps. I might just be mad enough to do that. If they'd let me. I need people to vote for me first. So I'd vote for you.
Well, thank you. It's been a real inspiration to understand your philosophical journey and the work you do today. Is there anything else you want to add into the conversation we haven't covered, or do you think we've put the world to rights and lined up a trajectory towards a humane education and a vegan future?
I am full of hope. I really am. The frustrations that I feel are only because I know that eventually it will happen, and it's just, it feels like it's a marathon, and occasionally I just want to sprint, but I am so hopeful. I see my daughter and daughter's friends, and I work at the vegan camp out, and I go to the vegan kids festival, and I see how the vegan community is growing and all these new documentaries that are coming out, and I am full of hope. I am. And so I just, I think for me it's important to end on a positive note, and just, I admire the work that everybody mentioned today is doing, and I just hope that I do get to live to see some of the benefits, whether it's myself or somebody else who pushes this over the line. And yeah, I look forward to seeing where it all goes.
Yeah, change can happen fast. What's the best way people are following you, reaching out for your help?
The Vegan Society website, if you type my name, Laura Chepner, into the search bar, it'll come up with the education page, and there's all different ways that you can get in touch with me there. I am on Facebook and Instagram and other social media platforms just as Laura Chepner. So feel free to follow me if you just want to see pictures of my daughter or myself practicing aerial hoop. It's nothing groundbreaking, unfortunately. I leave all of that for my actual work hours. But I am going to be at the vegan camp out this summer. I run the TVS Education Family Marquee, and I'm happy to meet families, talk to families. I'm there all of the time, Friday through to the Sunday. I don't move from that spot. So if anybody's thinking of coming to that event, then please do come and say hi. Other than that, it's just, Vegan Society, where all my resources are as well, and information about the Education Network. If you're a vegan teacher and you want to join the Education Network, I'd be more than happy for you to get in touch through the website. We're always looking for fresh talent. Diversity is the spice of life. So feel free to, if you're ever in a situation where you need advocating for, or you have advocated for someone, I like to hear good stories as well as the not so good. So I just love talking to anybody about these topics in any situation. So please feel free to get in touch. And thank you for having me.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you for being a guest on Sentientism, Laura, and more power to you. I look forward to you joining the new Labour government when it's elected.
Thank you. See you there. I might need some help.
Yeah. All right. Take care, Laura. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Please stay in touch.
Thank you.